this video, we're going to cover the file storage system, right? So just a simple file and how to use that in App Inventor 2. So we've gone through and set up an app for us to use as our example app. And it has a few labels, as we see. There's instructions in them, and then a couple arrangements to make things look nice, right? So we have a label and a text box that's grayed out, and it is also disabled, right? Or unenabled, right? So that is going to contain the file contents, right? What is in the file, the text file that we're working with. And then we have a text box down here that's enabled for the new contents that the user can type in, right? And then we have a series of buttons, and each of these has a purpose to interact with one of the blocks that the file offers, right? So we have add to the end of file, which is append. We have save and overwrite. So we can save something to the file, but it overwrites all the contents that are in there currently. We have delete the file, which will delete the file, and we'll go over the problems with deleting the file as well. And we have a clear text box, right? So that just clears the entry that the user has typed, and an exit button for our app for exiting our app to show that the file, when we launch the app again, is actually storing the information, right? So our file is under storage, and it's just a file here, and I've already added one here at the bottom. It's a non-visible component, so we see that it gets added, and I just called mine saved text entry file. You can call yours whatever you'd like, right? So you can go through and add these buttons, add the other user interface items, two text box, a couple labels, to get the app to look similar to what we see on the screen. And you can see that I have a few spacers throughout the component tree, right? And that's just to separate the items out a little bit. Those are all 1%, either width or height, right? Just to make things look good. And this is just a one-screen app. So this is the user interface for that app. So if you can go ahead and make that, we will proceed after that. So pause the video or wait for the next video, and then proceed to the blocks part where we explain each of the individual blocks for the file entry. Remember, file, text files under storage. Alright, now we're going to look into the blocks of the file, right? So we've set up the user interface, and now we're going to start building our blocks. So we have our backed press, right? That's from under the screen. Backed press. We also want our screen initialize event. So we'll grab that, and these are the two events we should start off with. Our backed press should simply exit the app. So we close the application and we press the back button, right? Our operating system back button. We also have an exit button, so we can grab that really quick and repeat that same step. So our exit button, click, and close application. Right? So those two are the same, but then we have our screen initialize. And so when we initialize the screen, we have to read from the file, because we have a text box that's supposed to contain all of the information that's currently in the file. Right? So our current file contents text box contains all that information, and it's got a multi-line property that's been checked, so it can have many lines in it. And we simply want to set that property, right? Set the text box to some text. So how do we do that? We need to read the file. So let's look at our file blocks, and we see that we have after file saved event, and then we have a got text event, And then we have a couple procedures: append to the file, delete, read from the file, and save the file. All right, we're going to go over each of these that we need to implement our app to use basic files to kind of explain how files can be used, and then you should be able to use them in other apps in similar ways. Okay, so if we want to initialize our text box, we have to read from the file. So we want to call the read from, and then we need a file name. So that just involves any name we want, and there's specific things that we could add to the file name to help out Android. But if we just want a file for this app specifically that no one else can touch, we can just name it. And we're just going to name it users text.txt. So it's going to be a text file, and we're just naming it that. We can choose any name we want. And since we don't want to type this everywhere, we should really put it in a variable so we can use the variable. So instead of typing users text.txt everywhere we need the file name, we'll go ahead and make a variable called file name, or my file user file name. Okay, and we'll stick that in there, and then we can just get the user file name from this variable, right? So that's the same blocks, but now we have a variable, so instead of typing this literal everywhere we need it, we can just use our variable, and if we ever want to change our file name, we can change it in one place. So now we've called read from, and we've read from our files to try to update our text, right? Our text box that contains the contents. But reading from the file doesn't actually do anything or know where to set that. So we have to look at our events, and it looks like this got text is an event that gets triggered. And so when this gets triggered, when we're done reading from our file, and all the contents of our file will be in this text variable that the event gets passed, right? So that's a parameter for the event. And so we want to take our text box that we're supposed to display the current file in, and simply take the text property and set it to the parameter that we get, right? So now when we read the file, we'll be updating this text box. So whenever we call read from, this event will get triggered, and then we can update our text box. Okay, so now we've loaded our app. We've seen that when we load our app, the file is loaded. If there's nothing in it, then our text box has nothing in it. If there is something in the file, then our text box will have contents. Okay, and so let's look at some of the other things we wanted to implement. And we wanted to implement some of the other buttons that interact with our file. So we look over here on the left, and we have buttons for, we have a text box for typing in, but then we have buttons for saving in various ways onto the file. So we have Append, which takes the contents of the text box that the user typed in and adds that to the end of the file. Wherever the end of the file is, it takes all the text and adds it. So now if you typed A and you hit append twice, your file will have 2 A's in it, right? The first time it appended A to the empty file, which now has 1 A in it, and then you hit append again and it put A at the end, so you have 2 A's. So this can be useful if we're adding something new to our file, but we don't want to use append twice to put all the contents in our file twice accidentally. The save button will save all the files, all the text that the users typed into the file. So we have 2 different buttons that we need to implement. Let's move them down to the center, and we can go through them, right? So in our append, we want to go and look at our saved text, and look, we have an append to file, right? So if we append to the file, what text do we want? We want the text that the user typed, and that's going to be in the user entry text box, so the text value. So that's the value we want to append. And what's the file name? We simply get the file name, and that's what we want to append to the file. Similar, we can go through and save the file, right? So we did append, now we have save down here, and we want the same options. But like we said, append will add the contents to the end of the file, where save overwrites the file completely with the contents in the text. So if we had hello in our text box that came from the file, and then we said hi in our user entry text box and clicked save, we'd now have hi in our file. If we clicked append, we'd have hello, hi in our file. Okay, so now we need to do one other thing, right? So the user expects the contents of the file to show up in the text box. So we need to read from our file to update our text box. Okay, we could also use the after file saved, but that doesn't give us the contents of our text box, right? We could also not read, we could just do it ourselves and update the text box. But for the sake of using the file blocks, we will read from the file. So it's not always the quickest way to do it. We could just do it ourselves and update the text directly. But in this case, we'll read from our file. And once that's done reading, it'll trigger this event, got text, and that event will set the current file contents text box, the value, the text, to whatever was read from the file. So now we've updated that screen, that text box in the top, to have the current file content. So the user will see the update immediately, right? And that's what they should expect, right? The file contents are displayed, so if you save it, then the file contents should be updated. Otherwise, they may think that the saving didn't happen, all right? So we've covered two of the buttons that we've implemented that interact with our text file. And then there's the third button that deletes the file, right? So if we look, we have our delete button and our clear text box button. So our delete button is going to just delete our file. Okay, so we can go through and we have this delete procedure. And again, all it takes is the file name. So we get the file name from our variable, and this deletes the file. This isn't always a good thing to do, right? Deleting the file gets rid of the file. And then what happens if we try to save or write to the, or append to the file? That can be problematic. The file doesn't exist anymore. So instead of deleting, what we really mean is delete the contents of the file, right? So this file can't be deleted because it's specific to the app. So the only reason the app exists is to write or read from this file. So if you didn't want the file, you should just uninstall the app. So instead of having a delete button that deletes the file, what we're going to do is we're going to disable that, so that would delete the file completely. What we're going to do is delete the contents of the text box, right? So we want to go through and get the text box, right? So user entry, current file, text box, dot text, and set that to an empty string because our file needs to appear to be empty. And then we want to save the empty. Right? So we should save it first, save the empty text, duplicate. Right? So the first thing we're doing is saving nothing to our file, so it's empty. And then we update our file contents box to empty. So this is the same way we could have just read from the file, but since we know it's empty, we might as well just empty the text box as well. Okay? So that essentially deletes the contents of the file, but doesn't actually delete the file. Okay? So, okay, that's our delete button. And we have one more button to go through, and that's the clear text button. And simply clears the text box. So we don't want the current file contents text box. We want the user entry text box, and we're going to clear it out. Right? So this will empty the text box that the user entered. So these are all the buttons. We have 2, 3, 4, 5 buttons that we've implemented in our user interface, as well as using the event that our text file provided and initializing from a read. Okay? And this is how we use a text file. Okay? We can store any information in here, and we can either overwrite it with new information, okay, however that happens to work, and then we could also append to the end if we wish to add more information rather than just store new information. Okay, and that's how we use a text file with user interaction to update the text file. So we have one last thing to cover before we declare this app done, right? So we have this other event after file saved. And what that does is it triggers once the file contents have been written. Right? So we have several places that we're saving the file. And then we're reading directly after that. That isn't good usually, right? So what happens if we accidentally read from the file, or somehow the saving didn't happen properly and now we're reading from the file, but that didn't work? So we don't want to read immediately after saving or appending, right? We simply want to read once the action is completed. So after the file has been written. So if we hover over this, we can see that the event indicating that the contents of the file have been written. Right? So something has been written to the file. And in that case, that is when we want to read from our file name. Right? And we could use our global file name because we only have one file. But this is a generic event. In case we have multiple files, we're going to have this event, and when we have something saved, right, our file, it gives us the file name, and then we can act on that file name, whatever we want to do. We can check if the file name was what we expected, or in this case, instead of performing the read immediately after the append and the save, we're going to do it as soon as the operation has completed. So once we save the file, once it's completed writing to the file, it'll trigger this event. And that's when we can read from the file. And when we read from the file, what does it do? It triggers this event once it's done, got text, and that will update our current file contents text box with the contents of the file.